Hello again. So the next few sessions we're going to talk about what's called mitigation policy. And mitigation is just the buzzword to say how does government bring in some policies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Because what we remember is if we left it to the market, people don't worry about exhaust going out their cars or the CO2 that goes up through the smokestack. So we need government to be involved in changing people's decisions. And what we're going to do today in this session is talk about what is the actual task. So the first point is to think about what are the main sources of greenhouse gas pollution. The really big one is the combustion of fossil fuels, that is the burning of coal, gas and oil. And so we use this to produce electricity that drives our industry, that drives our households and gives us lighting, heating and so on. It's also used for heat for industry. So many industrial processes involve the burning of fossil fuels to create heat and transfer raw materials into machinery and gadgets and all the sorts of things that we like. And of course it's used for transport. So running of cars and trucks, planes and trains all use fossil fuels, well most use fossil fuels in the main production system. There also are some other sources of greenhouse gas emissions, other manufacturing processes including cement, the iron and steel industry are the most important. Also we get fugitive emissions from mines. These are mainly methane from both coal mines and from gas production, and all that waste that you and I tip out each week or each month in the decay process, if we're not careful, a lot of that turns out as methane and CO2. And agriculture is another source of pollution. In particular, ruminant animals, this is sheep, cattle and goats, in their process of eating grass and then producing the meat and milk and fibre that we like, also produce big amounts of methane. And then the last big polluter is actually you and I. We breathe in air and turn the oxygen into CO2, that's carbon dioxide. That's actually a greenhouse gas. Now we conveniently don't worry about that in mitigation policy because it's all a bit too hard. Just to give you some example, the importance of different types of greenhouse gas emissions in Australia. As just one country, there's about 600 million tonnes a year, and that's about 1.4% of world emissions. Now those emissions are made up of stationary energy, that's the most important, so that's mostly electricity. So in Australia, 90% of our electricity is generated by the burning of coal or gas. Now you'll get different numbers in other countries. Some places like Canada, mainly hydropower. Other places like France is mainly nuclear. But Australia, we're big on that. And again, burning gas for heating in homes and in industry. Transportation, so this is running our cars and trucks. That's mostly burning petrol and diesel. That's 13% of Australian emissions. Other industrial processes like iron and steel and cement, 5%. Fugitive emissions from our mines and wastes, 7%. And agriculture is as high as 14%. If you go to a country like New Zealand, agriculture accounts for about 70% of their emissions. So these are where we get the basic emissions. And of course they vary from country to country and they vary a bit over time. What's kind of interesting is if we think about those emissions, in the first round there's only a few firms that actually are the polluters. If we take electricity, there's only a small finite number of electricity generators. If we think about transport, yes, there are millions of cars and trucks, but we can just as easily pick up on the refiners. So there are big refineries, and if we were to change their decisions, that would then flow on to truck owners and car owners. Again, most of those industrial manufacturers, certainly in developed countries, are big companies, often multinationals. Fugitive emissions, again, a few big miners and even local councils in their waste disposal. But of course in agriculture, in every country where we have farmers, we generally have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of them. So in the first round, we've really only got to look at seriously at a relatively small number of major greenhouse gas polluters. So if we think about the task of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, in the first round, as we've just discussed, there's really just a small number of polluters. So these are the big fossil fuel-fired electricity generators, the producers of petroleum products, as we said, a proxy for consumers of petroleum, a few other manufacturers, and we're there. However, this is just the beginning of the process. Almost all businesses use electricity and transport as an intermediate input. So if you think about food, suppose we didn't want to change the decision of farmers, but farmers buy electricity to run their milking machines, they use trucks to transport their products, so they're actually consuming a lot of electricity and energy in their production process. Then when the milk or the meat leaves the farm, it goes to a slaughterhouse or a dairy to be processed into fresh milk, put into cartons, produced into butter, made into ice cream, all these sort of products. These are very energy intensive. And then it goes to our retail stores. So in developed countries, it goes to supermarkets. They've got refrigeration, they've got lighting, they've got all these sort of things that are using lots of energy. And of course, households directly use energy. We buy electricity, we drive cars, but also almost every good or service we buy has some energy built into it. So the sort of message out of this is, if we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, even though only a small number of firms can be said to be the first round direct polluters, indirectly everybody's in the game. And this we can illustrate with this diagram. In a sense, the first round of polluters are in this box 1 energy. This is your electricity generators, your petroleum manufacturers, and some of your big cement and steel. Now then, again, we have a choice. We could use that energy by renewables, say solar, wind, or even nuclear. We'd get no pollution. Or we could do it from the combustion of coal, gas, and even oil. And yes, we get the desired product, that's the nice product, the electricity or energy, but we've also got this nasty byproduct going out the smokestack. That's the greenhouse gases, and that builds up into the atmosphere and causes climate change. And that's what we're worried about. Now, if we go back to the energy guys, some of that energy is directly used by households. And in a country like Australia, about 1/3 of electricity goes directly to households for own lighting, cooking, heating, and so on. Less than 1/3 of the petroleum products are used for driving our own cars. The really big action is used by business. Again, to go back to my example, the farmers using electricity and transport to produce their meat products and milk, then the dairy factories converting that into more desirable products, then them distributing that to the retailers and supermarkets, and then ultimately we buy that stuff. Now I kind of refer to this area as indirect pollution. So when you and I are buying meat and milk at the supermarket, there's no direct sort of pollution there. But indirectly, there's been a lot of pollution in the energy production that goes around and around the system. And finally, we do have the option of greenhouse gases of absorbing some of that pollution in biosequestration. That is like planting forests or algal farms, or we might even get to the whole stage of putting carbon underground, so-called carbon capture and storage. So the mitigation story is, where can I reduce pollution? Well, I could do it in box 1, the energy. So it requires decisions by all businesses, households and governments. So we've got to choose less polluting ways to produce energy. So that was in that yellow box, box 1. Less intensive ways to produce desired goods and services. So this is the business sector, that's box 2. Or we choose less energy intensive products to consume. So here are sort of examples. We could choose to ride a bike or walk to work rather than the energy intensive, pollution intensive car transport. Or we could find ways to sequester greenhouse gases. So this would be your carbon capture and storage or planting trees. And all of those, you can sort of see, require us to do things in different ways. And at the end, science, research and development, R&D as I've got written there, is about finding cheaper ways to find low polluting production of electricity, less polluting ways, more smarter equipment used in the business sector. You and I make choices about doing a bit of walking rather than driving, or wearing some warmer clothes rather than turning up the air conditioning. And we get some fancy scientists and businesses to create better ways, cheaper ways of sequestering carbon. So mitigation policy is all about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really any type of policy intervention that will change decisions by households so that we choose to produce and consume less pollution intensive products. So this would be wearing clothes rather than air conditioning, or walking to work rather than driving. Choose less pollution intensive production methods. So this would be businesses finding much smarter equipment that requires less electricity and transport per unit of product that they deliver us in our supermarkets. And we would want to be exploring and implementing carbon sequestration projects. So these are the sorts of decisions we want to change, and in the following sessions we'll look at various policy instruments that governments can use to con, if you like, households, businesses and themselves to move from the current highly polluting choice of products and production processes to ones that involve much less pollution. And if we do that, then we'll reduce the risk of climate change.